Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Methodist Way of Life, reflecting on a journey podcast and video. My name's David Goodall, and I'm the District Mission Enabler in the Yorkshire West Methodist District. I'm delighted to be joined by Fran and by Mark for this conversation. This is the fourth in our Methodist Way of Life videos, reflecting on the 12 stations of a Methodist Way of Life. In each video, Mark and I welcome a guest or a number of guests to talk about two of those stations and what they mean to them. I said a little bit about a Methodist Way of Life in our first video, and you can find out lots more on the Methodist Church website. We hope you enjoy this conversation.
Thank you, David. So let's meet those of us who are gathered here today. And we should mention that we're recording this during Holy Week. That's the week that runs up to Easter Sunday. And and the video will kind of be broadcast and the podcast will be released just after Easter. So with that in mind, let us introduce ourselves, say who we are, where we're from, and maybe what Easter means for us. So I'm Mark. I'm a presbyter. That means I'm a Methodist minister in the Leeds North and East Circuit. In and outside of Leeds. And Easter for me is a busy time sometimes, doing various services, walks of witness and things like that, as well as celebrating Easter when it eventually comes. But Easter, is that journeying with Jesus, journeying, reflecting on the story. And this is the end of my 15th year as a minister, so I feel as if it's a well-trodden journey, but it's always nice to find new ways of interpreting stuff, new ways of glimpsing things. So that's me. I think that's covered everything that I've asked of you, and moving on to, shall I say, Fran?
Yeah. Hello. So my name is Fran, and I am a religious studies teacher and also a chaplain at a Church of England secondary school in North Leeds. So recording this on my Easter holidays, which is rather nice. But what does Easter mean to me? So, I've been a Christian since my teenage years, so there's, like you, Mark, there's been lots of Easters on the way, and they're all very different, and yet they're all somehow the same. And I think that's really interesting, isn't it? You talk about that well-trodden path, and I think about that journey to Easter and that journey in Holy Week, and I've always really appreciated those points which are the same. That's kind of those meeting points, that point where you reflect on your own journey as a Christian, but also that wider Christian story. And I think that's what I love about Easter is a sort of reminder of who I am and what Christianity means to me, and who Jesus is and why he's so important. But it's also an opportunity to reflect on lots of other stuff as well. So Easter's cool. I like Easter much better than Christmas, actually. So
fantastic. Thank you, Fran. And David, what about you?
Yeah, so I'm David. We're a very Leeds gathering today. I also live in Leeds, very close to the school that Fran teaches at. And I get to serve the whole of the Yorkshire West District, helping churches think about their mission and their discipleship. So that's me, and you've heard that on some of the other videos too. I think Easter for me, I'd echo lots of what you've both said. This year, I'm journeying through Easter with the most northerly of our circuits in Settle, because their minister's on sabbatical, and it's lambing season. And I was just reflecting as I've been preparing this week that for me, Easter is this invitation to a different way of life, to new life. And how much that speaks in the rural context as I go. And actually, we don't know how many people we're going to have at church, because actually the lambs don't know that it's Easter Sunday. And if they're going to arrive, they're going to arrive. So we're going a little bit with who knows. But I think that invitation to a different way of life, to a new life with Jesus, is always what I take away from Easter. So that's a bit about the three of us, so you know who you're listening to today. We're going to think about two of the Methodist Way of Life stations, Learn and Flourish. And it's good to remember that each of the stations has a commitment, and the commitment at the Learn station is we learn more about our faith. It's that reminder that this new life, this walk with Jesus that we've each talked about, is open-ended, and there's always something new to learn. We all said Easter, you discover something different, even though you do it every year. So our faith is about all of our life, and therefore our learning is about all of our life in many different ways. So with those thoughts in mind, I wonder for the three of us, what has helped us learn and grow recently? And what would we like to learn about faith? What's that thing that if we got time, we'd like to understand it a bit more? So let's have a chat about those questions. Who go on, Fran?
I've got a very sorry. As a teacher, I've always got something to say about learning. It's a sort of essence of what we do in school. And I've got a colleague who always says to me, she says, every day is a learning day. I'm like, well, you're absolutely right. There's always things to learn. And I'm learning. So I teach religious studies. So I teach, and because it's in a Church of England school, 50% of what we do is about Christianity. So I teach lots about who Jesus is and what the Christian story is and why that's important to people today, all the way from, children at year 7 all the way to year 13, where they're really tackling some really bigger ideas about feminine theology or process theology and some big ideas. So there's lots of learning that happens in my classroom, and I'm learning alongside children, and I always think, every day someone's said something in a different way or has asked me a question that's helped me think about my own faith or what this Bible passage is saying, every single day. And I really appreciate the fact that even as a teacher, the way people talk to me and question me helps me to learn. So I think in everything we do, we have the opportunity to learn. I can carry on because I think for me, the word that I think is most important when we're thinking about learning is that word curiosity. And I think when I was younger, what did people say? Curiosity killed the cat, and that idea about not being nosy and not being, it's not your business. But actually, curiosity is a great word, isn't it? Because actually being interested in our story as Christians, being interested in other people's lives, being interested in other people's stories, actually that's what makes us human, isn't it? Having that real interest in other people. And I think for me, that curiosity in other people's lives, and I'm not talking about curtain twitching, nosy, I'm not talking, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a genuine interest. If someone's done something interesting, let's talk about it. Tell me about it. In my classroom, we've got children from such a breadth of Christian tradition, as well as children from other faith, so we've got children who go to really Pentecostal churches and have one particular experience of what maybe worship looks like, compared with children who go to an Orthodox church, who have a very different experience of what Christian journey looks like. And they're different, but how much do we learn when we're curious about each other's stories? And I think that's one of my favorite things about teaching and learning, is being able to be curious, because actually if you can find out about other people's lives, it also helps you to know them and to love them and to empathize with them and to stand alongside them. So I think that's my favorite thing, that curiosity.
And I think that's really interesting for me at the moment, because I think the role I'm in at the moment means I do a lot of thinking about ecclesiology, which is that word we use to mean about what the church is. So I spend a lot of my time helping churches to think about what the church means and who they are as a community and how they worship. And I've been reflecting in my own learning a little bit about, okay, well, what bits of my knowledge is that adding to in other areas of faith? So actually, I think often I don't do much thinking about those bigger questions about the nature of God or Christology, and they're big words, but because I'm very much in a role that helps people think about the purpose of the church, if I'm not careful, I forget to bring my learning from those other places in. And I think curiosity helps us to say, well, what else do I need to go and find out about? I've done this bit of thinking, but what else do I need to go and learn? And I think sometimes I get frustrated with people in churches, that broad way of saying the whole of the Christian community, which it's not. But sometimes when I learned that. I know what my faith is, and I stopped learning 25 years ago, and therefore the church should just be. And I want to say, well, that's 25 years of learning, 25 years of curiosity that you've missed out on. And how do we encourage people that learning is lifelong, and there are different ways we discover more about our faith? For me, that's been a lot about the church recently. But what else do we need to learn, and where do we need to grow?
I think for me in learning, and I think it kind of, what's the word? Not piggybacks, but kind of fits in between that curiosity and where the church is, like you've talked about, David. For me, we've been doing like a Lent book series where we've been reading through chapters of, I made a note, Living His Story by Hannah Steele, which at the time I hadn't realised was written during COVID. So there's lots of heavy COVID references throughout. But it was interesting because actually I was reading it, and the people that we were sharing it with, most of those are, I think all of them are churchgoers and have been for a number of years. They were kind of going, we're not learning anything brand new here. It felt as if it was, again, a well-trodden path of kind of evangelism, of kind of sharing kind of Jesus' story, all this kind of stuff. And it was all kind of fairly, kind of normal conversation stuff. It didn't really stretch us. However, it was the penultimate chapter when we're talking about the broader society and kind of where is society in all of this. And I suddenly found myself having to explain, I think it was like Marvel, about Thanos, about traitors, about various kind of TV series that she references in the books, and these folks are going, nope, no idea. Nope, no idea. And so suddenly it became this kind of movement away from kind of thinking about theology, but about applying it, about applying kind of our Christian journey to the world around us. And it was that kind of trying to give them permission to say, why don't you go out and experience this, or kind of chat to somebody that if you don't know about this, then maybe this is a bit of a challenge to sort of say, well, what are other people talking about? Well, if we know we're talking about Jesus, then what actually are they talking about? And is there some kind of common path we can learn together and kind of enter into dialogue and have that kind of shared experience, rather than just thinking, well, we've got this precious thing, thank you very much, we're going to leave you to it. It was that kind of challenge of, we need to be kind of involved in the world around us. It's no good just kind of keeping it kind of tight in a way. So kind of curious, but also apply that curiosity and that learning to the world that we live in.
Yeah, and I think that can be quite challenging, can't it? You know, actually, to when you realise, so for that congregation that you're working with who don't know what Marvel is and have never been entranced by who's going to be thrown out at traitors, you know, that's quite a challenge for them, isn't it? To think about all this stuff in the world that they don't know about. I was at a concert last night by a band called the Young Uns. I don't know if you've come across them, but they're kind of, I tried to describe them to my dad as socialist folk. I don't really know how to describe them, but they're a group of folk singers who have been curious about people's stories. So they've taken individual people's stories and they've said, well, what do we learn from this? You know, what do we learn about people standing up against fascism? What do we, as one community in Hartlepool that stood up against fascism? What do we learn about this one man who travelled the breadth of the country, during the 30s when things were really difficult? What do we learn about this guy who jumped into the Aegean Sea and swam for freedom because he didn't know how else to escape the difficult things that he was living in? And they take those stories, and stories that maybe are uncomfortable, and stories of people that we don't know about, and people and experiences we can never experience, and they say, well, what do you learn from that? What do you take from that? And I think that's probably what's going on, Mark, with your Lent group. People are being challenged by things they don't know about, but actually they all those things help us. They all help us become, well, I think they help us to become closer to who God wants us to be, because the more we understand about who we are and what our community looks like, the closer we can be to God.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on. This conversation could go on, and I'm sure it would be rich, but we want to also keep this to time. So I'm going to say thank you, Fran, for leaving us with that point about actually learning draws us closer to the people God wants us to be. And I think that's a really, really good place to move. And we're going to think a bit about the Flourish Station.
So indeed, we move to the Flourish Station, and I might get into trouble here, but I think this is one of the few stations of the Methodist way of life where the phrase or the little word flourish could be misinterpreted, or dare I say, be taken a different way. So flourish is not about kind of flourishing self or otherwise, but it is about the kind of awareness on caring for creation and all of God's gifts. And so it is a station which encourages us to care for the world, and one which seems really relevant to us, especially during the our kind of awareness of the climate and climate emergency, and what is kind of that tension, dare I say, and that kind of interesting place that we are in the world as we are. The commitment also talks about caring for all of God's gifts. So before we turn to the questions, I just invite us, what does the phrase all of God's gifts mean to us? Does anybody want to start?
I think one of the things that's interesting here is that in an earlier iteration, as the way of life evolved, this commitment also covered things like money and time. And I think it's right that it's become focused on the climate emergency at the moment. That is a real issue for us as the church. But I also think as Christians, almost thinking back to that conversation we just had about learning as well, how do we use our time? How do we divide it up in a way that honours the gifts we've got? I have a to read pile on my bookshelf here. I know that one of those books has been in the to read pile at least 11 years, and it hasn't quite made it to I'm not going to bother reading it yet, because in my mind one day I'll get round to it. But I know that I don't use the gift of time well to read. I just don't, because I think I'll do that when and suddenly the next meeting's coming along. So I think for me, some of those are the gifts that God gives us around how we steward time, how we steward money, how we steward resources a little bit as well.
That's interesting. I never really considered the whole kind of money as a God-given gift. In my head, I kind of applied it more directly to like nature and the physical world around us. And I know that can be present in people and in monetary things and bits and pieces, but I think I was maybe going to the primary source rather than of secondary and tertiary and that kind of stuff.
And I think I think the idea of, I think it's tricky. So one of the things I teach at A level is we talk about the prosperity gospel, and we talk about that sort of idea that's quite prevalent in some other countries' church theology, and how uncomfortable that makes me, and how uncomfortable, so I think God's gifts and graces are for all of us, and they are not things which some people have in abundance and others are prevented from having. And I think so when we start talking about things like money, I think, I feel uncomfortable with thinking about that as a gift of God. I think they are resources to enable us to do his work. But I think we had a minister many years ago that used to talk about our gifts and graces quite a lot. And I always really appreciated that. I thought, when we talk about our gifts and graces, it's like, what has God given me that can bless the world? How can I use my skills in teaching or my skills in, and so when I think about gifts, quite often I think about what is it that God has given me that I can use to bless others, I think would be my comfortable way of thinking about it. But it's really interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about gifts in terms of flourish and creation, the gift of creation is huge, isn't it? That's so when you talk about what God has given us, wow, what a world we live in. It just blows my mind all the time with amazing things we see and enjoy and are able to live amongst.
Maybe that's the danger of the phrasing being talking about God's creation and kind of gifts for all, is that it can so easily just kind of be the same, kind of in that one area or one category. Interesting as well, Fran. I won't mention it because this is going to go on a podcast and live, that there is a family member of mine who is very much into prosperity gospel, and I remember them one day kind of going, well, I feel as if God's telling me that I need to have a field, and I'm praying to God for however many £1,000 for this field, and I was there going, I don't think God works like that personally, but if you do, keep praying for it. And in the end, they went and kind of we went for a little bit of a conversational walk to an allotment, and they kept on talking about this. And I said, well, sometimes God, maybe you're so desperately asking for one thing, God's maybe saying, but what about this over here? And as I said this, there was a little voice come over the kind of the token fence of this allotment, and someone said, do you like beetroot? And my family member kind of went, oh yeah, and they went, here's some beetroot, and they passed a bag of beetroot over, and then a second bag of beetroot came over, and then they kind of went, how much do you like beetroot? And we kind of went, well, it's really nice, and so we got 5 bags of beetroot, and I walked back with this family member, and I kind of went, I think this just exemplifies what I'm saying, is that you might be so busy kind of going, oh, God needs to give me this money, whereas actually God today is just saying, here's beetroot, and then enjoy this blessing for what it is, rather than getting caught up in the monetary. God's actually going, look over here, look what I'm trying to give you over here. They didn't completely see why, but I've thought of that ever since. That was a fantastic illustration of sort of, we've got to be really careful to kind of narrow down God's gift in very small ways, whereas actually maybe sometimes if we take a step back, we can see kind of God's gift in other ways and broader ways. So I didn't mean to kind of go down that route, but anything more to add about God's gift or beetroot for that matter? Should we come to some questions? It says, how are we caring for creation?
Not enough, I think.
Not enough. Yeah, and actually that's always my answer to the second question, which is what's my biggest challenge, is that there's always more I could do. We've just done a really interesting thing, and this does come with a level of privilege as well, but we've just been on holiday, but we've done it all by train for the first time. And we were lucky enough to go to France on the Eurostar, and it was really interesting to do it all by train. So we didn't do any of it in a car, apart from a taxi to the train station at this end to get the suitcases to the train. But it was really different, and in some ways it was really relaxing to not drive and not use petrol and to use the train. But then it also presented its challenges. So when we got to the campsite and the laundrette wasn't working and we didn't have the car, it was like, okay, how are we going to get our clothes washed? We don't, and whereas if you'd have just had the car, you'd have just got in it and you'd have driven around till you found somewhere. So I think for us, it was a really privileged way to care for creation, which was to choose to travel by train rather than by car. But it brought its challenges that we had to navigate along the way. But it did feel like the right thing to do.
Yeah. I often feel, we talk about this is within my department at school, and I feel like in one hand I talk about the responsibility of Christians. We talk about the word stewardship a lot, and in Christianity, stewardship, and in Islam there's this similar idea, this idea of khalifa, the idea that we care for the world around us, and that is an important part of our responsibility as Christians, and who God's asked us to do. So we talk about this and we bang on about it all the time. And on the other hand, I feel like I'm giving them loads of bits of paper all the time, that they're sticking bits of paper onto other blank pieces of paper. And, they've got water bottles that we're trying to get them to recycle. I just feel like we're in this sort of dichotomy between, yes, this is actually our responsibility, but we're not really living it out terribly well over here. So it's really hard. It is really hard.
I find this really interesting one, because for me, I am recycling. I try and do that kind of side of stuff. We've just gone through a garage and I've gone 5 times the tip, and I'm trying to put very little in the general rubbish, and I'm trying to kind of split everything down into the right places. I've held on to various things. I mean, this is the first this is the tip run that I did where actually I took all my old kind of university work, because I was like, I've held on to it for 20 years, and I'm there kind of going, I've not opened it in 20 years, so I need to recycle this now, because it's just gathering dust, and so I really kind of feel that. But this is I guess the few days after we've had a billionaire take up an all-female crew into space, which I think is the message, or the tagline is really positive, but actually if you look beyond that, you're kind of going, but is this just tokenism? Is this just, what does this mean, where you've kind of got somebody who is a billionaire who maybe should be paying more tax? If you've got the ability to do all this, and they're going to go to me on my, on one hand, I'm trying to do this with all my cans and all my paper, and yet you've got like all this jet, so this space fuel busting into space, and they're going to going, I think one of these is outweighing the other, and no matter how much I'm recycling, how much is that going to be worth of the fuel and the environmental damage that this spaceship is doing? And I don't want to detract away from kind of feminism and the kind of all-female crew, but
I think that's for another discussion.
Yeah, it's not for this podcast.
Things that we can talk about there.
But purely just, I think it's for another stream, another podcast. But I think just in my mind, that moves on to the next question: is what is our biggest challenge in responding to climate emergency? Is how much of it is actually our individual responsibility, and how much of this is a much broader societal, big business, big industrial stuff, whether that's kind of AI and the amount of kind of servers and energy it burns through, even Google searches. I know that they do an awful lot to kind of offset that kind of stuff, but how much of it is in our kind of clothing industry stuff, where it's very easy to buy kind of cheap and affordable clothes, but at what cost to the environment further afield? We have these kind of businesses that are kind of throwing stuff into the water and polluting our nation's kind of waterways. But what companies are they? Well, what are we still buying from them in order to do that?
We don't, as the UK, I don't think we really understand the serious nature of this globally. And I think so we've just had a lovely week of sunshine. Well, we're all very much appreciating that. I'm quite happy about the idea of maybe a hotter summer. It means we can camp without worrying about whether it's going to rain or whatever. But actually in countries where actually that means that there's no food, or it means that all of your home has been flooded and everybody's walking around waist deep in dirty water, which is the truth globally, it's a different bag, isn't it? And so my fear is that places like the UK, and to an extent lots of sort of this bit of the world, I'm not very good at my geographical terms, but this bit, where the impact isn't so serious and isn't so in your face serious, that we don't take it as seriously. And I go, oh, I don't know if I want to spend that bit more on my fuel, or I don't want to spend that bit more on my car, That's really hard.
And I think some of it with all of that is also how we balance that. It's hard, we don't understand it, it's overwhelming, with actually every little thing can make a difference. So actually taking time to do our recycling, thinking about where we buy our clothes. And I think that for me is the tension. And don't we see that in lots of areas of life, that if the problem seems too big, it's easier to do nothing than do something. And actually something can make a difference. So how do we encourage each other? How do we encourage our fellow Christians to think about actually what's the extra little thing you can do that might make a bit of difference? And I think that for me is the challenge with this station, is coming back to it time and time again, says to me, where have I just maybe not thought about that? Where have I wandered past the shop and bought something because I've just felt open to it, or I've not been conscious to taking a water bottle, so I've ended up buying a plastic bottle of water, or like I think they may be really small things, but we know each small thing makes a difference. And we also know, if we look back through the last 20, 30 years, that various campaigns over our lifetime have changed culture, whether that be seatbelts in the back of a car or not dropping litter, and actually, ultimately, they make big differences, but we all have to be willing to do those little bits. And I think that's my challenge when I come back to this.
I know that we've got time is not with us, but my concern in some of this is about our privilege. And I know, Fran, you suggested about where we are in the world. For podcast listeners, I think that was like the top hemisphere, is it?
Yeah,
so I'm aware that you suggested Europe.
Yeah, sorry, Europe, areas where, we're not subject to drought and
but I think for me is that when we talk about making the decisions about what clothes we buy and things like that, are we in a privileged place of where we can actually afford to make those decisions, afford to buy organic, afford to go for an electric car over some other kind of gas guzzler or otherwise? I think so we need to not only use our choice but also our voice to speak up for those who can't make those decisions. And I think that's where it becomes more political, and I think that's where that's even more of the challenge, is to sort of not just make our own individual decisions but also to speak up for those who don't have that opportunity, which is hard but challenging, but also hopefully good and for the better.
Thank you, Mark, for that little challenge as we come on towards the end of our podcast. One of the things we always like to ask at the end of these conversations is, well, so what are you taking away? So that these podcasts are to help us think about, how do we reflect on our faith as Christians? How do we reflect on our journey with God through these 12 stations? And actually reflection leads to, so what are we taking away? What might this challenge us to do? And that might just be a sentence. It might be something you think you want to go away and do from today. What are you taking from this conversation, Mark?
Okay. I think it's just to continue to ponder about how we speak into things, speak truth to power and to big business and things like that, as well as it continuing to impact and speak to real life, moment to moment decisions. In the last few years, I have definitely moved away from a lot more kind of meat and otherwise to a better diet. And that's really been a challenge, especially growing up in and around farms. Not quite lambing culture, but that has been a real challenge. So I think it's just that kind of belt and braces of doing the stuff locally and for me. So I'm focusing on the environment bit, but then also how can we speak into this stuff, and how can we sign more petitions and kind of get our voices heard above the hubbub of the world around us.
Thanks, Mark. Fran?
I think I'm going to go exactly the same way as Mark with this. Is that actually sometimes you feel like you're making no difference at all with the things that you do, but to plough on. I think to plough on with recycling, to reducing the amount of meat we eat, but I think it has to be a little bit more than that as well. So I think it has to be, right, actually, how can we campaign? How can we get involved in broader projects that are going to make a difference, and that are going to speak to big business? Because actually, if we don't challenge those things, then we're in trouble, aren't we?
Thank you. I think I'll take us back to the earlier conversation and that line that Fran left us with about learning makes us into the people God calls us to be. And I thought that's my nugget to take away from today.
Well, bless you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for your participation, your thoughts, the conversation, especially Fran. Thank you. I hope you enjoy the rest of the Easter holidays whilst you can. I guess, folks, just broadly, if you think on ponder about who this can be shared with, this podcast, this live stream, then please do share us on your socials, and maybe kind of let's start as a campaign, shall we? And communicate. Next month we have Notice and Challenge, our M-Wall stations. So thank you for tuning in, thank you for listening, and please be part of the conversation and stand up for injustice and truth to power. Bless you. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.